I wanted to share an interesting repertoire idea that I stumbled across. And the idea is to have a very compact, minimalist approach for a repertoire against pawn to king 4 or e4. So black's response would be to play the Scandinavian defense with the queen to d8 variation. But I got this idea from a Chessable course called GM Alex Cholovic's Simplest Scandinavian, and I'll put a link to it in the video description. But and I will go through and show you how he arrives at this position, or this structure. But the idea is to try to get this structure that you see on the board right now as frequently as possible. So you get this restraint structure with pawns on e6 and c6, really clamping down on the d5 square. You get your bishop on f5, your light squared bishop, your dark squared bishop goes to e7, and the knights go to f6 and d7, and then you castle kingside. So kind of take a mental snapshot of this, and maybe I'll flip to this once in a while during the discussion. But this is basically what you're aiming for, and you're trying to get this as easily as possible. So the idea to get there is to play the queen to d8 Scandi. So now when you play this Scandinavian defense, about 3/4 of the time they will play knight to c3, and they think they're gaining time on your queen. And so what we do is we go back to d8. Now, if white's trying to play for an advantage, an opening advantage, they'll more than likely play pawn to queen 4, either now or at some other point. And the beauty of the setup that Grandmaster Colovic came up with, not that he came up with it, but he put the course together on it, is basically the idea is you play c6 followed by bishop to f5. Then you finish setting up your restraint structure to clamp down on d5. And then you develop your knights and then castle and bishop to e7, obviously. So you play c6. This is a normal developing move. Setting up the restraint structure. And this looks very similar to what we saw when we looked at the structure. It's the same structure for us, and there can be little variations on how white sets up, but the majority of the time you'll get this structure here, and you get it by playing c6 early followed by bishop to f5. So a little bit about this position, because this is what you would get on the board if you chose to play this opening in the way that he proposes. Basically, you have this restraint structure, and so one plan would be to play for a c5 break. Now that you're not going to get that all that often, if you do, you've probably equalized the position, or it's probably favorable for you. But if you do that, you just got to be really careful that the move d5 by white doesn't run into any tactics. So always double check it before you play it. Another idea would be to gain space on the queen side. So you could play a5. You could also move your queen out to either a5 or b6 to connect your rooks and bring them to the center of the board. And then one of the other main ideas, and this is kind of what's kind of cool about this little system, is that, let me get the paint off here, black can actually, let's just throw in a random move for white here. But one idea is for black to play knight to d5. And you see he's hitting two pieces, so he's going to force, as black, we're going to force another piece off the board, which favors us because we have less space. So if we get pieces off the board, we are less cramped. It's almost like if you had 5 people trying to live in a 4-bedroom house, and you got rid of one of the people, then everybody's happier because each person has more space. So a lot of times what to know here is they'll want to preserve, white will think they need to preserve their bishops, so they'll capture with the knight. And as black, you want to take with the c pawn. And then what happened is we transferred to a different pawn structure. And the cool thing is we've changed to this Carlsbad pawn structure, where our idea is we do this minority attack, and we can move our rook here behind b5. There's different ways to play it, but the cool thing is there's all kinds of videos out on the internet showing you how to play this Carlsbad pawn structure, because this is a very common pawn structure that comes out of the Queen's Gambit declined exchange variation, which is one of the most common openings played in chess. But the general idea is that we will shove this pawn up the board, likely with the assistance of the A pawn. We shove the B pawn up, and we create a weakness in their pawn structure, the base of their pawn chain, that we can attack. So that is something that you might see often. So kind of the beauty of playing this way is we have the restraint structure, which is what we saw at the beginning, and it often will transpose into this Carlsbad structure. So, I used to get so sick of hearing strong players say, well, don't memorize the openings, try to understand the ideas and plans. So it seems to me like this opening is actually one that is amenable to that, because you usually just get a couple of structures, and the structures have fairly easy plans. So that's why I really like this idea of really simplifying the Scandinavian and playing it with the c6 move order. Now, I didn't actually myself, I'm going to play it slightly differently, and I'll explain why in a bit. But if a person wanted the ultimate easy repertoire that is sound and completely playable, and you don't have to know as many plans, and you don't have to memorize tons of lines, this is be a very good way to go, in my opinion. So let's just look at some of the other lines. So this is the kind of, if we move back here, this is the type of position that you'll get most of the time. And the thing to remember is earlier on, white may try to play knight to h4, trying to swap off that bishop. We're fine with that. You just want to keep your structure, your restraint structure, intact for the most part. So you could just drop back to g6, let them capture, you'll capture back, and everything's good. So that being said, the majority of the time you'll get a position like this, a structure like this as black, and you can kind of play it with those general ideas. And my thought is I'm going to put some videos together as I learn the Scandinavian better, and I learn more of the subtleties. But I want to put maybe have a series of videos where I explore the strategy and the ideas behind these pawn structures, and behind the different lines that come out of the Scandinavian. So let's just look at I'll just show a couple other lines that can come up if they don't go down these main lines. But most commonly they'll play d4 and knight to f3, and you'll get this set up and you're good to go. But one of the other things, and this is what I think the beauty of this Cholovic's way of doing his course is, the second most common thing that you will face against the Scandinavian after you take on d5 with your queen is a lot of people, not a lot, but I looked it up, it's about 13% of the time you'll see this. So it's about 3/4 of the time you'll see what we just saw, and about 13% of the time you'll see this. And the idea is they want to not play knight to c3 yet, so that they don't obstruct their c pawn, because they either want to be able to play it out to c4, or they want to be able to play it to c3 after they play d4 to kind of bolster their center. But more often they will play c4 after d4. And all the gurus will proclaim that this is great for white and that they have this central pawn duo, so it'll go something like this. And the thing to mention, what's cool, is he just uses the same move order. He uses the c6 followed by bishop to f5, even against this knight to f3 variation. And then this is where white, usually plays c4, and they're all happy because they, have this central pawn duo. They have more space, and all the gurus say, "Oh, this is so great," and we're supposed to, as black, we're supposed to be like, "Oh, this is so scary," but it actually isn't. What's interesting is we'll maybe take a little detour and look at the Fort Knox French, the Fort Knox variation of the French defense, because you will often get this exact type of structure in that. And what's interesting is we can look at the statistics of it, but black actually does quite well at a master level, and we'll look at that in more detail. But the beauty of Colovic's idea here is that you still go c6, bishop to f5, let them have their pawn duo. They'll feel great about themselves thinking they have something, but in fact there's really not anything to worry about. So let's just kind of take a mental snapshot of this picture. What black will do is they'll just go back, queen to d8, and just play it just like we did in the main line. So we'll play this next, bring our knight out, bishop there, knight here, castle, good to go. So let's look at the French Fort Knox just as a brief excursion, and we can see how this type of position arises in that opening. And the Fort Knox can be played against the knight to c3 variation, or if white played knight to d2 instead, because what happens is black takes on e4. And now this is the key move of the Fort Knox. And basically, this is the bad bishop in the French, and they're trying to get it outside of the pawn chain and exchange it off with something of white's. And then you'll play c3, and you'll set up the structure like we just saw. So this is kind of a typical way it might go down. And then voila. What do we have? We have what we just saw against the 3 knight to f3 line in the Scandi. And so I looked at some statistics from Chesstempo to see how this, in general, how the French Fort Knox fares at master level play. And in 2,300 games, the performance rating only scored 38 points worse for black than for white. And that's actually pretty good. So anything less than 50 is like a respectable, solid opening. So it looked like the average players that played this Fort Knox had a rating of 2409, and they performed at a level of 2371. So I just bring this up to kind of show that this structure, even at master level, with players that average rating of 2400, it's very solid. It holds up. And so because we're not going to be playing Kramnik or Karpov or somebody like that can, really extract any space advantage or, whatever out of us, why not just go with this easy to achieve setup that we don't have to memorize all kinds of stuff to get to? So, we'll flip back and I'll just show you the other thing. So just take a mental snapshot of this and compare it to this, and you can see it'll develop into a very similar thing. So anyway, it's kind of interesting. And then I think that the other thing to just kind of mention is that when you play against against this pawn duo, or even not against the pawn duo, but once you get your setup like this, the key is to just play patiently. And what I was kind of astounded by as I was testing this out, when I first started playing this Scandi, after I came up with this idea of playing a very minimalist, easy to remember, easy to get on the board type of opening, I thought, oh, well, maybe it's too passive, you know, whatever. What's interesting is that, at least at my level, players become very impatient against it. And what I've tended to see is people try to transport pieces over here to the king side to try to attack you. This structure is solid as a rock. So they can't just like transport pieces over there, come at you, and think they're going to roll you off the board. And that's kind of good, because what I've noticed is not just in chess, but it seems like even just like in life in general, is most people feel like they always have to be doing something. And that's kind of how I found this, because I was trying to embrace a more minimalist approach to just not only life but to chess, so that it's not like an unpleasant thing where you have to try to memorize all kinds of things to get to a playable position. I just want to play chess and enjoy it, and I want to improve. And I don't think the way to improve is to memorize all kinds of opening variations. But I was just kind of astounded at my win rate has been really high with the Scandinavian. I'm scoring actually better than I do with white. So eventually I want to look for a simple approach for white, which I want to do embracing these restraint structures as well. But just try it out. Just see what people do against it. Just knowing a few key ideas. Just play it, wing it, see what happens. But it's just people don't seem to be able to just. If you want to try to get anything against this, you got to play patiently, and that's why we play patiently, because most people can't play patiently. It's just like if you notice, like in a conversation, if there's a moment of awkward silence, somebody has to try to fill that silence. Most people can't just sit there. This is the same kind of thing. We have this great structure. We sit behind it. We have other ideas like expanding on the queen side, transposing into like a more, like a Carlsbad structure where we have an idea where we do a minority attack. But if you look at it for white, it's very hard to come up with an idea, because they feel like they have the bishop pair and they have more space. So their intuition is that they need to try to attack you. They need to use that space. They need to whip something up before their temporary advantage dissipates, and usually they don't handle it correctly, because this is kind of like the last thing the Qd8 Scandi is one of the last things they're preparing for, because they see it so infrequently. So that being said, that's kind of the main ideas and the two most common approaches you'll see against it. And I just wanted to show a couple other lines that you might frequently see, and then we'll end with like what kind of the most critical thing that you would actually have to memorize a little bit, but not that much. But a couple of the more offbeat lines we can look at happen real early. So one idea is they may play d4 right away, and in that case we hit them with e5. We bust at them right in the center. And this is covered in GM Colovic's Scandinavian course, and it's also covered in a free course, which I'll also put the link to, by John Bartholomew, his free Scandinavian course on Chessable. And this can go down different paths. One way it might go is like this. But the thing is these offbeat lines are not very critical. So if you just study it a very little bit, just get the ideas, and you come out pretty well. Because usually when white is playing these things, they're usually just freestyling it over the board, and that usually doesn't work out the best for them. So you may see this, in which case you just you pin it. And the other one, which I've run into quite a bit actually, is this thing here where you get this early queenless middle game. And I've actually already done a couple of videos on that, and I've had very good success with it. Another thing you might run into, let me get back to it here, is they don't take your pawn and they just push past it. And what you can do, the easiest way to do it is if you want to just stick to your kind of general plan of getting your bishop to f5, that's absolutely fine. And then if they try to grab the center, you just play e6. And you basically have like this advanced French defense structure, but what's normally your bad bishop in the French is outside the pawn chain. So it's actually like a really good version of the French. If you want to have to, learn a little bit more, you could play c5 first with the idea of eventually getting the bishop outside the pawn chain, because what you might want to do is wait till they get their knight to f3, and then instead of putting your bishop on f5, you could put it on g4 and actually, use that as a way to get another piece off the board, and then you have like your French with the bad bishop not on the board anywhere. But it's perfectly fine on f4. And the other advantage of this is that, it contests this d4 square right away. And a lot of times in these advanced French structures, it revolves a fight where black is trying to fight for this d4 square and putting pressure on a d5 or on the d4 pawn if white plays d4. But you don't even need to know any of that to start playing. You can just right here play bishop to f5. So this would cover you for almost 95% of the stuff you would see. Just one little critical line that obviously you don't have to know too much, because Colovic's entire course is less than 20 lines. But if you play with his idea of playing c6 followed by bishop to f5, there's one line that you might want to be prepared for. But the cool thing is I looked it up in the Lichess database, and between 18 and 2200 players, it only comes up 2% of the time. So even if you don't know it, 98% of the time, you'll be fine. You won't run across it anyway. But it doesn't require all that much memorization, and you could just get that Colovic course and go that way, or you could, I suppose, just look it up in databases and figure out what you're supposed to do. But that line is actually this type of thing. And what happens is they hit you with g4. The idea being the queen, protects it. So when you play bishop to f4, they gain a tempo on you. And that's why this line can be a little bit critical. So this is the one scenario where you would want to memorize a few ideas. But their idea is to just kind of steamroll you really quick. And you just, you play e6 with the idea of you're threatening queen to h4. But it's, there's some details you have to know. So it would be well worth just getting Colovic's course for $4. And he has good explanations of the ideas. I was actually really impressed. It's one of the cooler things I've ever run across. I decided that, at least to begin with, I'm going to go down the path of using John Bartholomew's free Scandinavian course. And the reason I did that is not because of that I fear anything on here. And I actually like the idea of just playing the c6 and bishop to f5 against the knight to f3. Because the way I play it, I'll have to memorize a little bit more, but it's very manageable. That's the cool thing about the Scandinavian is because we play d5 right away and get them central pawns off the board. It's very forcing, so there's not as many paths that white can go down, so it makes our job much easier because it limits the number of structures we can get, the number of pawn structures and formations. So we have, a smaller subset of ideas we have to deal with, but also a lot less tactical, weird lines that we would have to know, and a lot of, just less ways that white can play. So I'll show you why I chose Bartholomew's free course. And basically, there's just a certain line that or set of lines that I like. And the idea is he plays knight to f6 before he plays c6, and I'll show you the reason, and there's nothing wrong with playing it the other way. I just really like these lines when they play, and you run across this is fairly common. You run across where they play a bishop to c4 very quickly, and there's this idea where you play a6, and the idea being is if you're threatening to play b5 and gain time on the bishop, and then you're going to develop your light squared bishop to b7. So white may, not necessarily be familiar with this. It scores really well with black, so usually they haven't run across this. So if they play a4, the idea is we play knight to c6, and we just use that b4 square as a nice spot for our knight. And if they don't play this, if they just develop normally, which you often see, then we play b5. And what's interesting is after they retreat the bishop, we can hit them with c5 because we're threatening to go to c4 and entrap their bishop. So usually what ends up happening is they'll grab that bishop, we exchange off the queens, and then we start making maneuvers to grab our pawn back, and they can't hang on to it easily. We eventually start rounding it up, and we don't need to go through all the lines or whatever, but I just really like these positions, and they score really well. And you can get at these type of positions other ways too. Sometimes they'll play knight to f3 before they play bishop to c4, and you can still use this similar kind of idea. So that's the reason why I ultimately chose to go with John Bartholomew's way of playing it. It doesn't mean that I won't maybe eventually play both of these ways, because I really do like the other way, and it's actually it's simpler because of the fact that you're always doing the c6 and bishop to f5, and I think it's a really good way to go. So maybe what I'll do is I'll eventually, I'll do some general strategy videos as I learn this, and I'll put links to those. I'll come back and put links to those in this video when I get those done someday. And the other thing is maybe what I'll do is I'll see if I can find some good videos on the on YouTube on the Carlsbad structure, or on those restraint structures. You might also see it called like Karo structures, because you get out of the Karo Khan more frequently. But the cool thing is if you just know you play that c6 followed by bishop to f5 after you retreat, and set your pawns up on e6, knight to f6, knight to d7, bishop to e7, and castle, like, you can get by without memorizing very much at all. And then you can just learn how to play those pawn structures, and you can play, you'll play pretty well without having to have memorized all kinds of stuff. So anyway, I ran across that when I was exploring my best options for coming up with a minimalist approach that still gives me good playable positions. And it was just fascinating to find a course that was less than 20 lines long that actually is fully playable, and you get good positions. So anyway, if anybody decides to try that, good luck, and I think it'll serve you well. So anyway, take care. Have a good one.